Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are and whatever time you're listening to us. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. We are starting a brand new book. It is called The Apocalyptic Vision and the Neutering of Adventism, a very weird title, but we'll get into that a little bit more. This book is by a theologian called George Knight, an Adventist guy, an Adventist lecturer, and a pastor, I guess, and he's held various different positions from all over the church, etc. But we're going to be having a conversation with George Knight together, all four of us, with John, with Dee, with Joe. Welcome again, guys. We're going to dive into chapter 1 today and see what we all thought of chapter 1. So I guess the question that I think George Knight wants to try and present to us off the bat is, why are you an Adventist? Was that your read too, guys? Yeah. Okay. So let's just start with that question. And I know it might be difficult to do this because we have already read the chapter, but maybe this might be a helpful question after reading the chapter. Can anybody answer the question in maybe just a short paragraph or so, why you are an Adventist? Does anyone want to have a crack at that question as we kick off, and then we'll just dive in? You, John, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I think I had this opportunity once I got out of medical school and went to residency. We ended up in New York for residency. And it was the first time my wife and I had an opportunity to be away from home, which had its own challenges, but it was also the first time we were out of the Adventist community and actually had to make that decision. Do we continue in our ways as Adventists, or do we start looking around for other options? And I think it was a great opportunity. Obviously, I'm still an Adventist, but it gave me a chance to explore, to look at other religions and get a better understanding of other religions, to continue to study my Bible and actually get into some topics I hadn't had a chance to get into. But more importantly, to kind of ask that question, why am I an Adventist? And it's interesting because my studies were wide open and I tried to keep it wide open, but I ended up staying an Adventist because I couldn't find anything else that came closer to believing the Bible the way I believe it. Now, you could say that I was hugely biased because I was born and raised an Adventist, and I was, but I do think everyone should have an opportunity to actually explore why and come to their own conclusion why, and not just the conclusion that your family or someone that taught you in school or church told you. So that's why I'm an Adventist.
Cool. Joe,
what about the other question? What about the other question? Why a Christian?
Oh, okay.
Well, that's a good question, because I think and I was going to say, that I'm not sure I totally line up with every single thing in Adventism. And I think Adventism has gone down several rabbit holes to some degree. And I think George Knight's addressing some of those. But I think Adventists, and I think George Knight brings this up, have gotten away from just being Christian sometime. And I think you have to be Christian first and foremost. And then I think being an Adventist is a little bit of a deeper dive, and in some ways gets you a little bit more into the weeds, I'd say, because I think there's a lot of denominations that cover a lot of areas of Adventism. And when you look at, the question I would have and throw out to the group is, what does Adventism have that no other religion has? Because I've heard one or two, maybe two or three things, but I'd be curious to know what Sam, as a pastor, understands, and George, as someone that explores, as well as Darlene, has to say about what is unique and why be an Adventist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's answer some of those questions. Joe, do you wanna have a crack at some of those questions, and in the same time we'll reflect on the chapter we read as well. Go for it.
I know again, I think the perspective that George Knight brings to the table is that he didn't get born into it like maybe John or myself or maybe
me.
Brian or you. He was 20 years old when he heard an evangelistic series like many others out there, right? Heard it for the first time. He got wowed by it, probably because of the beastly preaching, right? And he got excited.
He calls it the beastly preaching, yes.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he dove in headfirst, like many people, perhaps even like myself, when I really got into Adventism and realized that it was more of what he called the Adventist Adventism, right? Compared to the Christians, which are the other extremes. And of course, he is going to offer the suggestion of being an Adventist Christian, right? That's again coming back to his, I think, part of the first chapter. And I think similarly to that, it's kind of the experience that I had when I was born into it. I really, he also used the word, choice versus conviction. I didn't have a choice. I was born into it. I kind of followed what my parents did and did what my parents did.
Yep.
It was my parents' religion. And then when I went out to college, that was when I started, like perhaps like you, John, later in your life, but it was my college years that I went to a public school, and then I was by myself, and I left the church actually for about a year. I didn't.
Oh, wow.
pray.
I didn't know that.
I didn't pray for a year because I was searching and probably looking for a social environment. And then because when I went to college, I left, the social life of Adventism. And that's kind of like what he's talking about here. And I totally, I think resonate with what he was saying, and what ultimately brought him back is what brought me back. And of course, I studied, a little bit other religions like you, John, and I think, ultimately I came back to, like the Adventism gave me all the answers the other group didn't. And I was heavily involved in the Baptists group, the social life. But and I'll end with this of why I became an Adventist again, and why I think the question is being an Adventist Christian. Going back to the question you asked, Darlene. I think we should be an Adventist Christian, and I think ultimately, that's where I settled down in, because that's what I think George Knight is offering, kind of a solution to what we've to his, at least his search. He ended up wanting to be a Christian Adventist when one of his friends, I think was it the Jewish guy, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey,
It was interesting. The social part of his friend was what connected his Jewish friend to Judaism. And
Right.
he kind of recognized a connection with his Adventism in the same kind of aspect, at least to some degree. And I thought that was interesting.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. D, I feel like it's on the tip of your tongue. Go for it.
No. I was just gonna answer. I love this chapter. I love the way he wrote this book, the chapter. I mean, he's so sarcastic and he's just done straight out honest. And I love the fact that he was not born into Adventism, so he can kind of speak from as an outsider. And I think I've always thought that I never grew up, or I never been I don't know, guilt-ridden or had this Adventist baggage, because I think because my parents came into Adventism when they were in high school, both of them. So they did not grow up as Adventist. And I grew up in a household where both my parents emphasized prayer and relationship with God, but we never went through all that, I don't know, some craziness or
An extremes
in Adventist beliefs or practices.
So is it fair to say that would you articulate that you were first introduced to Christianity before you even interacted with Adventism?
I answer from myself, why am I a Christian, like 15 plus years ago? And I'm a Christian because I believe, I think this is the most obvious probably the answer is that because I was called by Holy Spirit and I accepted. And that's one answer. The other is because that's what ultimately gives me the hope to be able to live through this life. I think honestly, without that hope in God, I don't know. I think I would have already gone off somewhere and did all kinds of crazy things, just living for myself ultimately. And then why an Adventist? And this too, I think I really asked myself this question the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I think ultimately it's because I believe in the Seventh-day Sabbath. I believe in the Seventh-day Adventists truly do believe to what is close to the Bible as possible. And I think those things, those are top two reasons because of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
but it was interesting though, the whole community thing. I think because again, I mean, yeah. So again, I grew up as an Adventist all my life, but I just, in all honesty, especially after I left for college, I, for a while, I think just like you guys too, I mean, I didn't really exactly live the Adventist lifestyle. But I never felt like I left God. I've never left God. I've always felt like he was right next to me, always surrounding me, and never left God. But have left the lifestyle for a while and then came back to it. But I think that I don't necessarily recommend that for everybody, but it was, for me, it was not a bad thing. This whole community.
It's weird that you mentioned the whole idea of leaving and coming back. I think, Joe, you mentioned it too, leaving and come back. John, did you have a season where you left and come back?
No, I mean,
okay.
You were thinking about it, John.
No, well, no, I had an opportunity to make some decisions and to change my decisions as to how I wanted to believe.
Right.
I never felt like I left God. I mean, I remember hearing people say, yeah, like Joe did, I think, it's like, I'm just leaving, and some people come back, I guess, and some people don't.
Yeah.
But I never had this rebellious period of my life where I just walked away.
And I relate to that as well. I never had the rebellious play. I'm a born and bred Adventist. Well, I was born into that, I guess. I grew up in my local church, and all I ever knew was my mother's religion, which was the Seventh-day Adventist religion. I grew up in that. I sort of just accepted it. And I was, I guess, in some way thankful to the church that I grew up. They always handed me responsibilities, to ranging from memorizing the memory verses right up to eventually I was the first one to be called up for youth leader because I was willing. I was always willing to do something. And that kind of merged with my desire for acceptance in that community. In order to be accepted in that community, then you have to be willing to do whatever it is that community asks you to do. So you don't actually question the fundamental beliefs. You just like the fact that people like you because you're doing whatever it is you want to be a part of that community. But I did enjoy it up until the age of 15 when I finally got baptized. It was a personal decision I made, but if I have to be totally honest, I made the decision because I made the decision to get baptized at 15 because it made my mom happy. That was the reason why I got baptized. It wasn't because I necessarily loved Jesus with all my heart. And my mom was happy. When I got back at the pool, she was crying. She ran down the aisle, embarrassed me, and hugged me. All went out of the pool. She was happy. She was happy. But if I was to say where I truly made the decision for myself, it was probably when I just hit about 20 years old. And I was up and down with that. And then I started to grow in my faith, being Adventist, because I have to be honest and say, I don't think that my first interaction was Christianity. My first interaction was Adventism, because I knew all the prophecies. I knew everything. I could reel them off. I had been taught in that way, and it was the way that guided me. By the time I got to Newbold, the seminary, and I had to try and rediscover my Christianity, because I felt like I've never had the opportunity to do it. And the funny thing about it is, I almost was done with Adventism by the time I found my Christianity. Because I was like, hang on a minute, nobody told me about this Jesus. What do you mean nothing can separate me from God? Nothing? Are you serious? Yeah, I read the text in Romans, but I didn't read the text in Romans. What, nothing? Really? He credits his righteousness to us? But I'd already seen it through the lens of all the distinctly Adventist doctrines And if I was to be totally truthful with myself in reflection on what he's talking about and stuff, and if I was to be totally truthful, that wasn't real Adventism if you didn't have a foundation for Christianity. Because true Adventism, proper Adventism, has a rooted foundation in Christianity. And I think it was Joe who mentioned it, or John who mentioned it. Adventism essentially just makes you go deeper. It's like a microscope where you essentially find even more detail about what actually distinctly makes you an Adventist. And George Knight discusses a few things in this. On one hand, yes, he is very sarcastic. I'm not a huge fan of his cynicism sometimes, though, I have to be honest.
I love it.
Yes, he's very honest, but I understand where his cynicism comes from. It comes from the same place where I actually came from. And now I actually have a hint of cynicism in my own faith as it is right now because of the history that I've been brought up with. I'll be honest with you and say, the church I grew up in back home, if you were to put their theology and my theology side by side, I'd probably disagree with half of the stuff that they taught me, but I'm super grateful of what they took me through because they were the ones who charted the path for me to actually find Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and then put the microscope in deeper. Adventism gives me the wow of Christianity. It really does unleash what is behind the very details of what I truly believe. And so George,
So specifically, what gives you the wow?
What gives me the wow? Okay.
Yeah, so specifically, because that's the part I've questioned with, and I appreciate what everyone's saying, but I think I would say a majority of Adventists are cultural adherents.
Yes.
More
he called that cultural
than anything.
Yes. Okay, so one of the things that I'll say, there are many things, but I have to say the sanctuary message is huge for me. And I tell you why it's huge, because the sanctuary message really does echo the very core of what the entire of Christianity is about. It is about a sacrifice of a God who is willing to incarnate himself into humanity so that he can make provision for us to gain, and we're going to look back at our previous book, to gain sonship in Christ. And that to me, I mean, we know that theologically from Christianity, but the sanctuary message takes us deeper to match the Old Testament and the New Testament.
And that's one of two and possibly three beliefs that Adventists hold that are specifically unique to Adventism.
Definitely.
I mean, Dee mentions, the seventh-day Sabbath, but I mean, we have Jews that still believe in that. And you do have, and George Knight references the Seventh-day Baptists, which also was, Ellen White, I remember saying somewhere, is if you don't have an Adventist church you can go to a Seventh-day Baptist church. God forbid, but then you look at their beliefs and they line up. I mean, one of the founders of the Adventist church was a Baptist. That's, I'd be curious to know if anyone knows of any of the other beliefs, because my understanding of the other belief that's unique to Adventism is the state of the dead.
Yeah, that's another
fairly unique to Adventism. And then the third one that I haven't been able to confirm that I'm curious about, it goes back to the sanctuary message to some degree, but Jesus dying on the cross and then being at the right hand of God, and then the whole 1844 thing has Jesus actually doing something now after the cross. It answers the questions, what's happening theologically after the cross, and I think that ties in with the sanctuary message.
That's probably chapter 2. But can I
you didn't cheat, Joe, did you? You didn't cheat. Did you read chapter 2?
Joe probably read the whole book.
I did, and here's the reason why.
George,
I vote that we get Joe out of this Pages to Progress group because he can't stick to the rules. Anyway, go on.
So if I were to kind of bring it back a little bit, I think that you're touching on some things that I'm like, that's in chapter 2. I shouldn't say anything. But here's what I see it as. I see it as, if most of us, like me, I grew up in the church, and I kind of followed along, right? It became that community, and it's kind of like that Josh, the Jewish teacher that he's referenced to. He was an atheist, but he said, I belong to a community, and he related to his Jewishness, and that's many Adventists are like that. Mormons are like that. Baptists are like that. I used to live in Georgia. They could care anything about the Bible, but they're considered a Baptist, good old Baptist. And so community is huge, and that can be part of the reason why you stay in the church. But then all of a sudden he introduces his friend Robert Olson, who finally, for the first time, he exuded calm assurance. That's what he said. And the first time after 14 years of becoming Adventist, that he suddenly something clicked and said, "Oh, okay, now I became an Adventist by conviction rather than choice." And then all of a sudden he dives into this analogy of what Jesus was like. And of course, just like you, Pastor, he fell in love with Adventism philosophy, or the teachings which excited us, the beasts and the dragons and all that. And then all of a sudden he kind of talks a little bit, and I love this part. He says here that Jesus was not politically correct and had this sanctified arrogance. And that's part of the cynicism that I think both of you didn't like, or at least you didn't like.
Well, Dee loved it.
But then all of a sudden he then turns around and says, that's what early Adventists were like, right? That they had this same cultural defect. He said, they had this sanctified arrogance because they felt like they themselves had this mission, and mission field was the whole world, to tell this special message that, they had to give this message out right away, and they were the only ones that had it. And so, and that's kind of like what I fell in love with too. When I became born again, after I told you I left the church, I also got connected with the sanctuary message, and I read up on it, and I was on fire. And that's when I went from public school to private school. I went to PUC, and I just soaked it all up. But unfortunately, you can go Adventism, because I didn't want to be the liberal, what some people become, the what they call the Christian. Yeah, they're called Protestant liberalism, right? You give up the doctrines and you say, oh, ethics and live good lives and whatnot. And then ultimately, and this is what I love for us to kind of get to discuss. I like your thoughts on those three ways you actually neuter, Adventism, because once you follow, and again, all that's given, once you dive into Adventism, you become Adventist either through evangelical series or your own search. You become an Adventist. Why, he says, does Adventists neuter themselves? And I initially I kind of hated that term too, just like he kind of said, who likes neuterism? But because I'm medical field, John, you and I, we know what happens when someone gets neutered, right? So my question is, I like the fact that he says, and it was interesting for me to finally say, okay, yeah, I could see why people, Adventists, could be, neutering themselves if they fall into these three categories. And I would love for you to think about that. And I know we're going to get to it, but I kind of wanted to kind of say that just to say, hey, I see where he was headed. And because in chapter 2, again, sorry, he goes right into.
No, we're going to have to come down hard.
So
this is not
three
good for
categories, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first one is the beastly preaching that he talks about.
Right, that's right.
The second one is the lambishness of the lamb, taking away the lambishness of the lamb. And then the third one is the lion in the context of the wrath of the lamb. Is that a safe way of saying it?
The wrath.
Judah, right? The lamb.
Yeah. So I guess the idea of what George was working through, not this George Knight was working through, was the notion of there is a balance that we need to be trying to maintain in order to bring out the truth of Jesus. And unfortunately, for many of us, the Adventist has been so fixed on negating the other side. So here's a thought. I actually think, because of the nature, because of what I think it came first in Adventism, I think the Adventist gave birth to the Christian. That's my personal perspective. And so the reason why I say that, it's just Adventism became so abhorrent because it was so much about trying to satisfy the law without actually paying any mind to the grace of God, that people just wanted nothing to do with it. And so they decided, forget this, we're going to go and do some Protestant liberalism. Anything goes. And unfortunately, once that happens, I feel like Protestant liberalism rebirths Adventism, if that makes any sense. It forces people to go to the two extremes, and they should, because everyone wants to be what they are not, because they're wrong. And I think what George Knight is trying to do is push us to a medium, and part of that medium is showing us, no, actually Christ is both lamb and lion. And one thing is very clear that he brought out is, and I'll be honest and say, because I think probably my theology is more on a middle liberal, I don't know, side, maybe, but one thing that is very true is you can't just present one side of Jesus, because that's not actually who Jesus is. It doesn't do anything if we now have a faith where we have nothing to stand for. And I agree with George Knight. I think we're losing and lost many elements of standing for something that's worth dying and living for. Those are my thoughts. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah.
I mean,
Go ahead, Dee.
I mean, I honestly, personally feel like I've been questioning this to myself in the last few years, is that, yes, I go to church every Sabbath, and I go to church every Sabbath because, again, I believe in the Seventh-day Sabbath. But like you guys said, even, but why does it have to be Seventh-day Adventist? I questioned that to myself, and also questioned, what exactly am I doing here? Like, what exactly is the purpose of our Adventist church? What exactly are we preaching? What are we stand for? I've asked all these questions to myself, and I haven't honestly come up with a real good answer yet. So actually, I'm really enjoying reading this book right now, the first chapter. Anyway,
except unlike George, and unlike Joe, you're actually behaving and reading chapter by chapter. Anyway, go on, Joe. Go on.
Well, and so let's use church as an example, because, and you can accuse me of being a Christian, because I think I did go from my Adventism got a lot better when I became a better Christian. And I started looking.
Isn't that how it's supposed to be?
Well, yeah, but they don't tell you that when you're a kid or you're a young adult and you're growing up and you're struggling. And then you become an adult and you have kids, and it's like, that's the other time in your life where you kind of have a decision, which way are we going to go with these kids? And so that's where, it's like, I mean, like it or not, some churches are better than others. And there's not, and then there's
some Adventist churches, or oh, okay, right, okay.
In any church to some degree, but we're talking in the context of Adventism. And so some Adventist churches are better than others, but it seems like that's something where people take an extreme stance on. Church has to be in this order, church has to have this music, and church has to have these topics for the sermon. And that's what drives me nuts, because who says? And you step back and you look at Jesus, and he was a Jew and he wasn't an Adventist, and he didn't come to set up a religion. He came to save everyone's lives. And times change, and so and Jesus met people where they were in the times he was at, and I think he continues to meet people where they are in these times as well.
But that's why you're irritated, because you have come into contact with Adventism that is void of Jesus.
Well, that's what it ends up being. It's a construct of man. I mean, any religion is a construct of man, and as good as those men and women are that put together that religion. And so, unfortunately, and I don't want to preach heresy here, but the Adventist church isn't perfect. I mean, it was put together by people that weren't happy with the religions they had, almost 200 years ago.
Right.
And it met the needs of the time. And so I think, Dee, you have legitimate concerns. And like you were saying, why are we going to church? What role does church play in my life? What role does church play in the life of our community?
You said something incredibly important, Joe. I'm going to let you respond, but I just want to not let us forget what John just mentioned, because I think it was a good segue for the rest of the discussion. Please don't forget what you need to say, Joe. John, you mentioned Adventism did what it did to minister to the needs of the time,
Correct.
And I guess the question that I eventually pose, and I think George Knight also poses, so what does Adventism present for the needs of this time? I'm just going to leave that there. Joe, do you want to?
I'll answer that question.
Okay, go for it.
Good. Joe has an answer.
Yeah, it's like this.
Because he read ahead.
Yeah, of course.
Oh.
You know that student in the class
I'm
that
pulling everything
who
from
has
this.
read
Here we go.
the
I wrote
entire
notes.
book.
I wrote notes. Here it is. Here's this. He said, "Oh, I like this. If Adventism loses its apocalyptic vision, the vision that they had at the very beginning, forefront, like you said, it has lost its reason for existing as either a church or a system of education, because we have lots of, health education, right? PUC, all the other schools. I totally agree with that. And here's the thing, you're absolutely right too, Pastor, that, we have gone from one Adventism and people just said, I'm done with that. I don't want to hear any more beast, sermons anymore. And then they go over here and they give up everything and become this, liberal, let's go with, Christians, right? And just love everybody. And going back and says, I don't think, and here's another great quote I love, again, I told you initially, I was like, I don't know about this George Knight, but I'm beginning to like some of the things he says. And he says this, he says, as we move toward a less beastly approach to apocalyptic, we need to keep at the forefront of our thinking the truth that biblical preaching is not gospel versus apocalyptic. And this is what, John, you're saying. People have been, you got to either take this or you take that. And this is his solution. And I think this is a solution that people are missing when they become an Adventist. It says, but it should be gospel and apocalyptic, not either or. It's got to be both. And it's got to be a Christian Adventist. And I will tell you right now, and this is the reason why at the very end, he will say, you got to teach, preach the lamb. You got to preach the lion. That's the apocalyptic. The lamb is the gospel, Jesus, right? Jesus Christ. And I think if we don't do that, I think we miss the boat. And I think that that's kind of like what the early Adventist leadership in the early church, they were there for a time. And I will tell you another great paraphrase. He says, we need to do what? We need to reintroduce the, what was it say? I just missed it here. He says, we need to reform. Oh, give me just a second.
Okay,
go ahead, take it down.
Okay, you can.
So I would like to say I don't totally agree with him, and I had a problem with this chapter. And I don't have a problem with what Joe said, is in that we need to keep the gospel in the apocalypse. But I think for George Knight, the apocalypse is his sacred cow, and I think everyone has that. And I can't help but thinking that his point of view is a lot like the blind men and the elephant, because you're going to have Adventists that could, at least this first chapter, write the almost exact same chapter having to do with the seventh-day Sabbath.
All right.
The health message, education, health care. And the list could go down, to minutia. But those are the big categories. And the apocalypse. There's no one that loves Revelation and apocalyptics better than me. I mean, there are, but I like it. I thrive on it. It's an intellectually stimulating thing. It gives me hope, and it does pull everything together in the Bible. But I wouldn't say that's what Adventism hinges on, and that's what's going to, getting rid of the apocalypse.
What do you think it hinges on?
Well, and that's what I'm struggling with.
Okay.
I have a question.
Because I'm not sure. And if you ask me that up front, what does it hinge on? I would say it hinges on people being good Christians and being willing to follow the Bible, and this still being the closest religion that follows the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, that does have the benefit of some prophetic writings that enhance the Bible, but don't come in the place of the Bible. And oh, by the way, has had an health message, does have an education system, but it still comes back to Jesus and as he's portrayed in the gospel. And you're right, George. I mean, the apocalyptic. Jody doesn't like the beastly stuff. My wife, and she remembers it as a kid. It kind of turns her off to Revelation. She's still a good Christian. She's still a good Adventist.
I get that.
But they took Jesus out of it, and it ruined it. But it's the same thing
that's the thing. I'm coming to your question. That's the thing. The only reason why we have the typical Jody's response to Revelation is because, and I'll stand as guilty as charged as a minister of the gospel for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we've been preaching it rubbish. If you preach something poor, and if at least our people and our theologians aren't preaching it well, people would just start to attack it in very poor angles. People start to present it poorly. And so then it starts to gather some steam because it's not being spoken about, preached out, it's not being studied well. So we have turned ourselves off from the ability to actually have a healthy biblical response to how these things connect. And I think we need a rebirth. We need a rebirth on how we actually deal with apocalyptic literature, because it has literally been preached for as long as I can remember as burn or turn kind of theology.
Yeah, it's scare tactics,
which is incompatible to the Lamb of God. Totally incompatible. And we also need to do better with terms like judgment and the end of days, and there's a number of things that we have. So sorry, Joe, I think Dee had a question or something she wanted
I have a
to
question. Yeah, so when George and I is talking about using the word apocalypse, he's talking about just the whole second coming of Christ, the end event. That's what he's referring to.
Well, actually, he does more than that. The apocalyptic.
Okay, what exactly is he referring to? I have a question about.
Is the genre of literature in the Bible, Daniel and Revelation. It's prophetic writings.
Prophecy.
The entire whole thing.
Yes, it's the prophetic.
So and he's
presentation.
Okay. So he's saying that basically in this chapter that message is what the Adventism hinges on. Is that what he's saying?
That's my read of what he is saying.
Okay, that's what we need to be preaching. That's what we need to focus. Our Adventism should be focusing on. Is that what he's saying?
I don't think it should be focused on. We should be presenting the whole gospel.
Yeah, I took it differently. I think what he was saying is that if you take away the apocalyptic, meaning that the Daniels and Revelation studies, then we become like any other church.
That's how I understood it.
Why do we need to exist?
That's what George is saying.
Our Adventist heritage came out of, and that's again chapter 2.
Right.
It came out of people who came out of the Great Disappointment, trying to figure out, hey, what's going on? And you're absolutely right, John, that they all came together, and from different religions, because Adventism wasn't there. They came out, they restudied the Bible, and gave an answer why Jesus didn't come, and they got a clear understanding, and that actually was prophetic. In fact, John and Daniel said it is going to happen. There's going to be a great disappointment, and now all of a sudden they're going to be full of knowledge, and this knowledge that they're going to be filled with is this understanding of Daniel's and Revelation. And we, as an Adventist community, religion, came out of that becoming a mission, not necessarily a denomination. We had a mission. And that is the problem I think that we fell into. We settled down. We kind of wanted to be like everybody else. We had this incredible message that came from this apocalyptic, meaning a better understanding of Daniel's and Revelation. Unfortunately, for many people, John, and I totally get it, because they use the term 666 and the scare tactic until you have to, like you said, I never heard that, but burn or turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, it says here, and I love what he said, because I think this is true. It says here, the centrality of the Christ and his life, death, and resurrection, we need not avoid the apocalyptic. To the contrary, Christ is the centerfold of the apocalypse in both the Daniel and Revelation. And I agree with that. And unfortunately,
no, I agree.
We missed out on that. That's not what we've been doing. And unfortunately,
definitely.
And what people see Adventism as is a group of people who are fanatics teaching about dragons and pointing fingers at the Catholic, system, saying they're the 666. Unfortunately, what we should have been doing is turning people to Daniel's Revelation and saying, hey, look at this. There's Jesus
Right.
in every single word. And
Right.
I
Right.
love
Right.
the word revelation. I think you and I both know we've heard at least one sermon that says revelation is a revealing of Jesus Christ, not revealing
Mhm.
of who the 666 is. It's
And
Jesus
yes,
Christ. That's
exactly,
the link.
exactly. Guys, you're gonna hate me, but we do have to end. That we've just been in first gear, getting into this book right now. If you know what manual car drivers are like, but it looks like it's going to be quite a rigorous walk as we get through things. And I'm gonna call you out in front of everyone, Joe. Behave yourself.
I know.
Okay, you can't go past chapter 2. That's it. That's it. You stick
Oh,
with
he
us, and
read the whole
You
book.
read the whole book, probably.
John, you already
George, you read the
I
whole
read
book.
it a long
Anyway.
time ago.
Anyway. Guys,
It's a good book.
I think something that's really clear right now is, at the very least, God is inviting us through these pages to revisit what it truly means to make Jesus as the central figure of our entire faith. And I can't remember where I heard it from, but I remember someone was questioning someone about, do you understand Revelation? Yeah, I understand Revelation 100%. Said, what do you mean? It's such a difficult book. No, it isn't. It's easy. Go on then, explain it. It's easy. Jesus wins. That's it. That's literally the book of Revelation summarized. And I think Joe put it so well. We've far and few between have we heard the message where that is the conclusion. And usually what we end up in is on so many different tangents. But I think what George Knight is trying to do is to try and root us back to the reality of what truly makes the heart of the gospel message so powerful. And I think we can all agree, his name is Jesus. His
And
name
Jesus,
is Jesus.
Pastor Sam.
Jesus wins, but you can't say that without throwing in, as a result, we can win. Because
Okay.
it's through his winning that we are able to be saved.
Yes, I can take that.
And
definitely.
win eternal life with him,
Definitely.
forever. Sorry.
Good. No, perfect. Go on, Dee. Are you going to open a can of worms?
No, I'm not going to. But I'm just saying. I think he's also, asking the question is, what exactly does the Seventh-day Adventist stand for? What exactly do we stand for? And for him, at least in chapter 1, he's pointing to the apocalyptic message. With both having balance of Jesus,
yes.
and
right.
But yeah.
It's not necessarily, at least what I say, it's not necessarily Jesus and apocalyptic.
It's both
together.
It's the apocalyptic reveals Jesus.
Is one
reveals Jesus, and
yes,
and that's something we will get into more as we dive into this, guys.
Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, our time is, as you can see, for those of you who are watching us online, for those of you who are connecting with us, there's so much to reap from this conversation. We want to encourage you, join the journey with us. It's very simple. Jump online. You can buy the book. It's called The Apocalyptic Vision and the Neutering of Adventism by George Knight. It's not really showing very well in my screen. Maybe one of you can show. Thank you. You can also buy it on, is it Kindle, Joe?
You can go to Amazon and buy the Kindle version, or just the Kindle version.
Great, and you can get that online. Join the journey with us. We'd love to be able to hear some of your thoughts. I know that this is definitely going to be one that's going to get our blood going, but hopefully, God willing, the Holy Spirit is going to be leading us through this whole process. So we thank you so much for joining us online, wherever you are. And we're going to cut the conversation, even though we've got tons to say, which I'm sure we will feed into the next chapters. We'll be back with you next week for another episode of Pages to Progress, where we will be discussing and looking at chapter 2 of this book. So God bless you. Take care, everyone. Bye.